This is the Craft Equation, where conversations about craft brewing, business, and culture all come together. I'm your host, Cameron, co-founder of Earth Brew Co. Now let's crack one open and get into it. We are so excited to be here. This is a special holiday edition. I've got Chris Baker, the hot seat now, because I'm going to fire some questions at you.
I love it.
This is actually going to get broken out into two parts. This is the Science of Haze. Part 2 is going to be more focused around the science itself. Part 1, we're going to be talking about stylistically what sets different types of hazy beers apart from one another. Chris, thanks a lot for being here as usual. Appreciate your time. Yeah. The last episode we did on PFAS in beer was super interesting. Folks, if you have not listened to that episode, you got to go get it now. We talk about the role that forever chemicals play, mostly related to beer. We do dabble a little bit in some other PFAS topics, so definitely go check that out. Before we get started, I'm thirsty. Since we're talking about hazy beers, and we did not plan this, I promise, but I am drinking our new hazy IPA called Motor Skills.
Me as well.
Nice. Motor Skills is part of our Project X series. It is a beer and art collaboration. This label was done by Mid-Mind Arts on Instagram, so please check him out. This is brewed with Amarillo, Citra, Mosaic, and Nelson. Wow. Talking about dropping the hop hammer.
We made another beer called Timber Giant for the Treefort Music Festival up here. That was the pale ale, but used this hop combination. The thing I like about this particular hop combination is that there are a bunch of beers in the world right now that are fantastic that feature two of the hops in this particular combo. So like Amarillo and Citra go really well together. Like Citra and Mosaic go really well together. Like Mosaic and Amarillo go well together. So like it's kind of the perfect union where all of the hops play off each other and create a really cool product.
Oh my gosh.
I do like this.
Okay.
I think it's good.
Not a lot that we do here on this show is rehearsed, if anything at all, as you can tell by the Hollywood level production. I can promise the audience that this is the first time I'm having this. It's probably not the first time Chris has, but we just released this over the weekend. This is my first impressions. Absolutely delicious. Why did I choose this beer? Well, it's a hazy IPA, and we're here today to talk about hazies. As you can see, just visually, this is nice and hazy, right? And we're going to talk about what role the appearance plays stylistically and things of that nature. So, Chris, when we talk about hazies, it's become a much broader category now than it was even 5 years ago, right? Shoot, 10 years ago, if I'm just thinking back to the origins of the hazy, it was pretty limited to the New England IPA, right? That was sort of like the origin of the whole thing. Is that your recollection?
More
around
or less.
At that point? So
I think it might have started a little bit before that when they really started to catch fire. We're going to talk about the different versions of hazies and what they are, but it's a neat style. And I think it's a little bit of a reaction to the West Coast IPA. So like way back in the day, so 15 years ago, you talk about, 2010, it was all about West Coast IPAs. It was about just gritty nuclear bitterness. And I think that the market kind of shifted back the other way where hazies, the idea is that you get all that hop character and flavor, but with a much more like less bitter product. So it's a little more drinkable. And I think for a lot of drinkers, that bitterness is what really drove them away from the initial IPAs. I think they're a little bit more up their alley, a little bit more down the middle.
So are you saying the advent of the hazy IPA was a reaction to the overdone West Coast variety, or do you think it came from somewhere else?
To a degree. I mean,
Heady Topper was anointed as the original hazy IPA out of Vermont.
Agreed. And it's funny because as you talk about the definition of hazies and where hazies have gone, heady falls in an interesting aspect of that. You talk about some of the unfiltered styles. I think heady was a good stepping stone to get to where a lot of hazies are these days, although I don't think of it as being specifically a hazy IPA. I think of it as being more of an unfiltered, lower bitterness West Coast IPA, which isn't far off of what a hazy is, but at the same time is not necessarily what we see today. I do think a lot of the attributes of Heady Topper are what got us to brew this style. Even in our own lineup, Buku was built as a less bitter West Coast IPA. I think that was a lot of its a draw early on, is that it represented more balance. So I think brewers were messing around with the idea of what hazies are. I don't think the wheat fraction and some of the other things that we'll talk about later are as prevalent in Eddie Topper as they are in some of the other ones. But at the same time, it was definitely one of the beers that kind of started driving the IPA train that direction.
Now, when you talk about unfiltered, and we'll get into the science in the second episode, but I want to talk about what's become nuanced scale of what most people would regard as hazy. I wrote a detailed blog piece on our website that I would encourage folks to read. Go to motherearthbrewco.com/word and search for haze, or you can, simply scroll down and find it. But anyway, there have been a lot of misconceptions about hazy beers, and I hear it a lot in the tap rooms. Folks come in and, what do you have that's hazy? And I would say probably 90% of people that have questions, they don't necessarily know exactly what it is they love about hazy. A lot of people still wouldn't be able to describe to me what the difference is between hoppy and bitter, right? So they're just saying, I like the amount of flavor, but I also like that it's not aggressively bitter. And I think that's universally appreciated by fans of hazy beers. The problem with that, and why this topic often needs clarity, is that not all those things are mutually exclusive. It is possible to create hoppiness without bitterness. It is also possible to create bitterness without hoppiness. When we're describing beers, I'm talking about stylistic nuances in the beers we make. What is the difference between an unfiltered beer and a hazy beer from a Brewers Association style guidelines standpoint?
On hazy, we're going to build on the science and typically run a really heavy wheat fraction in, versus an unfiltered IPA. We're trying to capture all of those dry hops, or all the dry hop flavors. An unfiltered IPA can be anywhere from being a hazy to being a West Coast IPA. That doesn't really capture the stylistic direction or necessarily what the brewer's intention was with the beer. The hard part about craft beer is that you have brewers with all varying types of technology. A lot of brewers don't have a filter. And so their West Coast IPAs may look like some of those hazy IPAs, but stylistically, they're very different beers and the amount of bitterness that's in them and stuff like that. So an unfiltered, IPA to me is more of a broad stroke. If you said it was an unfiltered IPA and it was a hazy, that's kind of misleading.
It is, but we were everybody, industry.
Yeah. Before we learned the science of hazies and figured out how to really get it to be stable, we did use those terms a lot of times to describe them, in which case those beers exhibited the characteristics of a hazy IPA more than they did a West Coast. But I've also made a ton of West Coast IPAs that have been pretty hazy. The reality is that unfiltered doesn't necessarily define what the brewer's intention was. It just defines what the beer appears like. An unfiltered IPA in most cases is going to be hazy or have that hazy look in a glass, but might be a little more see-through. Whereas a hazy IPA can go from not white and obviously can't see through it to like murky, where like it's almost like kind of produces like a dark look in the glass because it's murky if you want to go to that level. It just depends. There's the sliding scale. But if you say juicy, most brewers, if they were going to, open the hood of the car and show you the recipe, most hazies are going to be the same. Whereas if you look at unfiltered IPA, it could range from an old school West Coast IPA all the way to a hazy IPA.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that's what makes this style so unique. IPAs and pales are probably the most synonymous with hazy beer, because you would never say, oh, give me a hazy wheat beer. That would be an American wheat or a Hefeweizen, right? And wit. There are already pre-existing old world styles of beer that have their own names that were not named off the appearance of the beer. So it's just interesting that we took something and named it after what it appears to be.
Well, you have Weizen, which is going to be cloudy by definition. And then you also have a Crystal Weiss, which would be the same beer, but clear. That gets into your conversation about unfiltered. Like a Crystal Weiss is inherently filtered and usually crystal clear. It's pretty much the same beer, just a filtered and unfiltered version, or a clear and a non-clear version. When you talk about hazy, the wheat aspect of it is a lot of what makes it the way it is. It's like you really get into it. I mean, there's probably a good level of influence from the Hefeweizen on hazy IPAs in the sense that you have so much wheat in it that
Sure.
it creates some of that in general. It's interesting that we did define the two. I would say that if they weren't so inherently East Coast and West Coast either, you would have more gray area, but they are inherently like hazies were kind of the East Coast's answer to the West Coast IPA that
Yeah.
was dominant
It
at the
was
time.
like, yeah, it was funny. I brought this up in one of our past pods, which is that when I was in New York with the fam earlier this year, I ordered an IPA off of a menu at a rooftop lounge. And when I got it, it was hazy. I put my hand up to grab the server and be like, this isn't what I ordered. Then I realized that that's just IPA there.
It's just different. To your point about unfiltered, you can have a really hazy West Coast or a really hazy, more bitter
You
IPA
can,
if you
but
want to.
I feel like you could pass that off more 5 years ago than you can now. Like I think now
True.
there's certainly an expectation that if you order a hazy beer that it is mostly opaque, meaning you cannot see through it, that there is very little to no settling, that it's completely homogeneous. I could be wrong, right? Because I'm a beer guy. Like maybe your average Joe shopping at the supermarket doesn't have those same set of expectations, but I feel like that's well understood.
I would expect you to identify that too. The difference between unfiltered and this is actually a hazy. But yeah, to your point though, if I went to the East Coast, that's more what I would expect. And if I went to the West Coast and they said it's an IPA, I would expect it to be pretty bitter, clear, and a West Coast IPA.
Hazy IPA, let's just call them hazy IPAs for a second. Um, they certainly have found their home in the pantheon of beer styles, right? I would say certainly one of the most popular, and despite the vocal minority screaming from the rooftops that hazies are dead, they are absolutely not.
Yeah.
So I would say at home, even just speaking personally, on any given night, it's a 50-50 shot on which one I grab, whether it's clean or hazy. I love them. I know a lot of other people do, but where do you see this style going, given its history and its popularity?
I don't see it going anywhere. I think that it's important. What I see happening is probably a unification of the two styles, which is that if the theory is true that beers were too bitter as West Coast IPAs, and now you move to the hazy side of things where it's a lot less bitter and bitterness is supposed to be very much on the back burner and not a big attribute of the beer. I think you're going to see a lot of clear IPAs move back towards the middle and see a lot of clear, less bitter IPAs. The only reason I say that is because as a brewer, they are very stylistically different. You brew hazies, then you brew West Coast completely different. Where a West Coast really shows the flavor of hops when they're added boiling process. Hazies really exhibit during dry hop. I think you'll see those kind of move back together. We'll make a less bitter product at the end, but we'll have more of a combination of the flavors where it really shows the diversity of hops and what they can really do.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I don't think hazies are going to go anywhere because I don't think that bitterness isn't for everybody. Let's go back to the commercials, and I don't remember if it was Bush or Natural Ice, the bitter beer face commercials. You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
That was Macro's way of taking a shot
Taking
at
a
craft.
shot, yeah.
Waiting for your blind date. You're scanning the room. You've got minty fresh breath and you're oozing charm. Then it hits you.
Larry?
Oh, bitter beer face!
Yeah, not everybody wants that. So I think they'll both exist. In my ideal world, we would see drinkers move towards the middle where they realize that the combination of the two styles really produces the best product. Where you've got not a lot of bitters on the hot side, but a lot of hot side flavor combined with just a badass dry hop that really produces anything that shows the unique traits of each varietal of hop. The one thing we want is we want IPAs to be varied. We want to have IPAs that show off Mosaic or show off Citra, Galaxy, or Sabro. I want them to explicitly show the characteristics of that hop. I'm hoping that we find the middle where I can pick up 10 different IPAs and they're all going to taste different based on the hop combination that the brewers use, the yeast that they use, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't think they're going anywhere. And honestly, Cameron, in our book, our fastest growing brand is Project X. So I don't see it moving. I do think you'll see what people are deeming the modern IPA, which will be this like balanced, clear. Because there's one there, and I don't take anything away from hazies, but there's one downside to hazies in that they're usually finished a little sweeter, caloric content's usually higher than with the really dry West Coast IPA. It would be nice to see them combined and get the best of both worlds.
And we have done that over time. When we first started making them, we were using lactose to back sweeten them, and I know you moved away from that a long time ago. That's a very popular brewing method for in the New England variety. But if you could just expand on that last comment you made a little bit more, modern IPA thing, that's even really like a new style for me to understand. I know we've had them run through the tasting room and stuff. Can you explain a little bit more about those? And then, just expanding a little bit on the caloric thing, but you also didn't mention shelf stability.
So
We know it does not do wonders for. So those two.
with the modern IPAs, if you were going to go to competition and enter an IPA judged based on style guidelines, well, if I enter a modern IPA, which is going to be balanced bitterness, more down the middle on the bitterness front, but very hoppy, if I put it into the West Coast or IPA category, because it's not bitter enough. If I put it into the hazy side, it's going to get disqualified because either A, it's not hazy, or B, it's too bitter. I'd like to see the unification of those because it will actually produce a different style. When you talk about caloric content, hazies, because of the amount of dry hop that you put into them, tend to pull out this heavy, what we would call tannins, or bitterness or astringency to some degree. And so brewers balance that by having the beer finish at a little higher gravity. But that means that if I'm going to make a beer finish at a higher gravity and be like 6.5%, 7%, that's to start at a higher gravity. And so that ends up leaving more caloric content in the beer than if I make a beer that's dry and finishes at a lower gravity. It doesn't have to start as high. Therefore, there's overall less caloric content in the beer. Some hazies, like I said, especially if hazies have lactose in them, the caloric content is going to be much higher.
Yeah.
If you have sugar in it.
Just to define a couple terms here that Chris used, gravity refers to the beer's viscosity, and it's relative to water. When you start making the beer and you've got grain sugar water, known as wort, it has a very high viscosity. But as the beer ferments and the yeast eats that sugar and converts it to alcohol, the alcohol is lighter than sugar. And so the relative gravity or viscosity of that liquid gets lower and lower. As the yeast starts to eat those sugars, the less residual sugar that ends up in the beer. What about the shelf stability part of it? What kind of challenges are you dealing with in the brewery when it comes to shelf stability?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. This is my own take on it, but the reality is that sugars or even starches to a degree are somewhat of a preservative. In my experience, dry, clear IPAs tend to have a shorter shelf life than hazies. Hazies, in my experience, tend to last longer, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's more residual sugar left in the beer, and I think that allows the beer to hang on a little bit longer. You're also looking at a beer that's getting most of its hop flavor just from a dry hop. So the reality is that it's mostly volatiles and stuff like that. So you would think that would be shorter, but I tend to find that it's longer. And I say that because I've seen Buku in its 15-year life. I've run it dry and I've run it sweet. Now it lives in the middle. Seeing how the beer responds to some of those things. It's an interesting perspective, but the reality of it is I think that hazy's hold a little bit, which is another reason that I think that they're more popular, especially in package format. They're susceptible to oxidation just like any beer. I've always felt like they don't go quite as south as a West Coast goes. You pick up a West Coast that's oxidized and it's nuked, it's generally undrinkable. Hazies can be that way, but I think tend to get to the latter part of their lifespan a little bit better. But again, that's mostly just my take on it. I'm sure there's a lot more science out there from bigger brewers or from guys that have done research that have seen other results, but that seems to have been mine. We've made a lot of really dry IPAs and seen shorter shelf lives on them. I believe it to be relatively true.
I feel like if I look at even just beers in my fridge that I've reached for that I felt past their prime, if you were to graph the decline, the West Coast variety seems to fall off a cliff. The hazy, there's a much more linear fall off, where it'll be like, that's not quite as fresh. A week later, it's still hanging on there. Whereas, Buku Ascent, stuff like that, it's just boom. It's like wet cardboard 2 days after it was fantastic. That's interesting that you said that. I didn't really thought about it that way. But my understanding, and again, I haven't been on the production side in years, but I was always taught any sort of haze, regardless of its origin, is a binding site for oxygen, which is the death of beer. I'd love to dive into more of the science. Why do you think that is?
Depending on how you produce hazies, If you make murky hazy, a lot of times what that means is you've got yeast still in the can, which means you will have some sedimentation and some stuff like that. That yeast in suspension can actually play to your benefit. That yeast has the ability to consume and eliminate oxygen degree, which would give you, like packaging a beer with yeast in it, a better shelf life. The reality of it is that having some of that in there helps. I can't really speak to how wheat beers hold up long term. It could be that it's not necessarily residual sweetness causing the beer to age better. It could be the fact that it's wheat versus barley because we have such a high fraction of wheat in our hazies. So there's other variables to play in there, but like I said, with some experimentation and even just some bigger beers out in the world, like a beer that I know to finish inherently sweeter, I'm a little bit more comfortable buying an older can than I am with ones that finish really dry. It also comes down to the brewery and how they package and how good they are at it and how well it's monitored. But that's always been my rule of thumb. And I've seen that in Buku, for example, when we moved to Idaho and I had the ability to change how I mashed. I was able to finish it a little bit sweeter. I thought it held on better. It's something we're working through with the scent. If the scent gets really dry, what does that shelf life do? But there's a ton of factors that go into shelf life outside of that. But as just a rule of thumb, that's kind of where I've always lived. And I think that Hazy embodied that. I am more comfortable drinking an older hazy. If I bought both cans of hazy and a West Coast IPA and I bought them at the same time from the same brewery, they were the same age, and I put them in my refrigerator, I would hypothesize that in 60 days, if I picked up the hazy and the West Coast, the hazy would taste better. More like it did initially versus the West Coast. But after 15 years of brewing and doing a lot of these IPAs, that's some of the stuff you start to pick up on.
Yep. So this deep into the conversation now, I want to bring it full circle here. Because we're going to wrap up. I want to get back to the conversation about the style. I bring this up because I was just reading the Brewers Association style guidelines for juicy or hazy India Pale Ale. So this is the most recent set of BA style guidelines. A lot of people who are not pro brewers or brewery owners or might know BJCP guidelines, which are the amateur beer style guidelines. They do resemble each other very closely. A lot of the BA guidelines are built off of BJCP style guidelines. So there are some small differences. As pro brewers, typically when we enter a competition that's larger, like a Great American Beer Festival or World Beer Cup, we're going off of BA style guidelines. Whereas if you enter a competition judged by volunteer amateur brewers or drinkers, they're judging based off BJCP, like the Los Angeles International Beer Competition, San Diego International, and North American Brewers.
North American Brewers are the best of craft. And each one of them typically publish. The biggest thing is that they publish the guidelines prior to entry. Review where you think your beer lands, but they're not always the same.
Right.
You have to be a little careful. When you get into the real nitty gritty, like it's different in World Beer Cup than it is in Great American Beer Festival, than it is in Best of Craft, than it is in San Diego International. So you kind of depends on how many categories they want to judge, and it also depends on who writes those guidelines. BJCP is probably the closest to being a good guideline to go off of.
Yeah.
Also, very competition to competition.
So I would ask the audience here, and I would ask you the same thing, to kind of think in your mind what you regard a hazy beer to be. And what I'm going to do is, because I don't think that a lot of people will take the time to go read the style guidelines off the BA website. So let's see how close this resembles what you've imagined. We've got color pale to copper, clarity chill haze acceptable at low temps, hop haze allowable at any temperature, perceived malt flavor and aroma, medium low to medium intensity malt attributes, perceived hop aroma and flavor high to very high, exhibiting a wide range of attributes, including floral, piney, citrus, fruity, berry, tropical, stone fruit, sulfur, diesel-like, onion, garlic, caddy, resinous, and many others. So for those of you that are turned off by some of those are descriptors that are very commonly used. A lot of that has to do with just needing to find something. It's kind of like the Psalm syndrome, the freshly opened can of tennis balls.
Yep.
Perceived bitterness, medium high to very high. Fruity esters are low to high. Diacetyl and DMS not present. Those are off flavors. And aromas low to medium body. The point of reading these is so that listeners understand. Just because your favorite hazy may be full in body instead of medium to body doesn't mean it's not a good beer. And it doesn't mean that it's not a hazy. It just means that if it were to be entered in competition, if it had too big a body, finished too sweet, it could be disqualified. This is the game we play with entering competition beers. Use of water with high mineral content may result in a crisp, dry beer rather than malt accentuated version. Sugar adjuncts may be used to enhance body and balance. Hops of varied origins may be used for bitterness or approximating traditional American character. Any use of thiolized yeasts, terpene blends, or any other advanced hop products should not overwhelm the beer and should be in harmony with the overall flavor profile. Versions of the style brewed with non-traditional yeast, fruit, spices, or other flavors are categorized as experimental India Pale Ales. Versions of this style brewed with darker malts may be categorized as experimental India Pale Ales or possibly American-style black IPA. All right, so that was the description. For the technical specifications, we've got alcohol by volume at 6.3 to 7.5. We've got a huge bitterness scale of 50 to 70 international bittering units or IBUs. That's a pretty wide range. I mean, 20 IBUs. Now, granted, I think the like perception of bitterness in the lower ranges, like between 15 and, let's say the lower end of this, 50, are more apparent. Once you get above 50, it becomes harder to distinguish each 10 IBU jump and on the scale. Is that accurate?
And IBUs are so hard because we measure them and there is a test to run IBUs, but measured and perceived IBUs are completely different things.
Mm-hmm.
So like a 50 to 75 IBU hazy that finishes sweeter is going to seem less better than a dry IPA, like a West Coast IPA that finishes at 50 to 70. In those style guidelines, the hardest one to disqualify you on.
Yeah.
Because you could make a 70 IBU hazy that would get kicked out for being too bitter.
Yeah.
And it's still within style guidelines. It's just not, it doesn't come across. The people judging your beers don't have any equipment at the table to measure the actual bitterness. They're just doing it based on perception.
Right. To your point earlier, who knows if you're at the upper end of that scale, you design the recipe at a finished IBU of 65, but then it's so loaded with hops or it's just so fresh that, there's like a, let's say like a grassy flavor coming through as an additional 10 IBUs. Could you get DQ'd for that? Absolutely, because it's up to the discretion of the judges. Your SRM or standard reference method is 4 to 12. I think the point of this is what makes this style so hard to pin down. It's also what makes it exciting, right? There's so much variety to it. It's like a choose your own adventure. You could have a pale in color, slightly hazy, bordering on unfiltered, 6.3% IBU beer that tastes like resin and pine. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you've got something like a double hazy that's 70 IBUs, got a ton of residual sugar in it or sweetness, lots of body, just an absolute meal in a glass, and then everything in between, super fruity and tropical. I think that's what makes hazies so attractive. You never know what you're going to get. And I think that's also what makes drinkers of hazy IPAs somewhat indiscriminate in the hazies that they drink, right? Like West Coast IPA drinkers, you have your brand, and that's the one these days. Back in the day, everyone was experimenting with everything, but these days, you've got kind of your go-to IPA. Like you go to the store and you're like, that's the one I buy whenever I can find it. When we get people coming into the tasting room, they're typically not looking for a specific type of hazy beer. They'll just say, what do you have that's hazy? And I think it's that way, not because they are unsophisticated. I think it's that way because that's part of the adventure, right?
100%.
Can brewers push these styles? The BA can hardly even clearly define it. The scale is massive.
100%. I totally agree. It's funny because you talk about the color and even just that, like there's brewers that brew, and we are one of them now, that brew with Pilsner baseball because it's lighter in color. So we're looking for that like bright, pale, like don't really want to touch on yellow if we can avoid it. But all the way to the point where some of the really big guys back east, like Treehouse or somebody like that, who brew with crystal malts in them. And so they have like a more orangey color, but that's their style. a 50 or 70 IBU beer that finishes at a low gravity versus a high gravity is perceived completely different. As judges in competition, that makes it even more difficult. You don't have any of those tools, you don't have any of those specifications, so you're just trying it. And you may award a gold medal to a beer that's not in that specification because it drinks like it is. I would say that West Coast IPA is much more drilled down and parameter wise, and hazies can run the gamut. They can be a million different things, which is probably one of the most attractive parts of it.
Sure. I think it's safe to say we went off the rails. Really fun topic. I love this style myself. I'm really enjoying this motor skills, by the way. We're actually going to take a break, and then in episode 2, we're going to dive into what exactly makes these beers hazy. And we're also going to talk about some best practices for brewers that we've learned over the last, what are we on now? Year 8 with this program? Year 7?
Yeah, it's been a while.
Right? It was the August before COVID that we started the Project X series. And then we really got serious about our hazy program. Stay tuned for that. We will drop that episode in a couple weeks. For now, I just wanted to say thanks again to Chris Baker for coming to talk to us about hazy beers, their origin, and what makes them so delicious and fun to drink. If you like what you see in this episode, consider jumping on our website and picking some up. This merch is available at motherearthbrewco.com/store. These are our flannels. These are our 15th anniversary hats. Make sure to go shop. Chris is wearing his gear too. You like a brewer, you got to look like a brewer. That's the best place to start.
Nice.
Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thanks, man.
Like what you see? There's more where that came from. Check out our other content or find us wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to drop a comment and let us know what topics you'd like to see covered on the Craft Equation.